Out here, justice was never blind. It just turned a blind eye. Redemption Creek, a forgotten town hidden between blood-stained mountains and unforgiving dust, where past sins were buried shallow and ghosts walked among the living. Sarah Blackwood knew the taste of violence. Its bitter aftertaste haunted her every sunrise. For 12 silent years, she kept her hands clean, raised a boy unaware of his dark inheritance. But peace built on secrets never lasts. When evil rode into town, it didn't come with guns blazing. It wore a familiar face, whispered a name, Sarah buried long ago, ghost shadow. Now the lies are crumbling. Blood calls for blood, and debts demand to be paid. In Redemption Creek, no one's innocent, not even the heroes, and this time silence won't save them. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek, casting long shadows across the dust-covered Main Street. The small western town stirred slowly to life, reluctant to face another day under the merciless sun. But up on the hill in a modest homestead overlooking the valley, Sarah Blackwood was already awake. She stood on the porch, her silhouette hard against the orange glow of sunrise. A woman not yet 40, but with eyes that had witnessed lifetimes. Her hands, steady, deliberate, poured steaming tea into 3 worn cups. The steam rose and disappeared into the morning air like whispered secrets. "Elijah," she called softly, "tea's ready." The old man emerged from inside the house, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to live with pain. His weathered face creased into a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "You're up early again," he said, settling into the rocking chair. "The nightmares." Sarah's gaze drifted toward the distant mountains. "Just habit." A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind shared by people who knew each other's darkest truths and chose to live with them anyway. "Ma." A young voice broke the stillness. Thomas stood in the doorway, 12 years old and already showing signs of the man he would become. His eyes, observant, cautious, moved between Sarah and Elijah before he stepped onto the porch. "Good morning, son." Sarah handed him a cup of tea. "Sleep well." Thomas nodded, but his eyes lingered on his mother's face a moment too long. Even at his age, he sensed the weight she carried, though he couldn't name it. No one in Redemption Creek knew Sarah Blackwood had once been known by another name, a whispered name that made even hardened men look over their shoulders. No one knew she had been the only surviving student of the legendary Ghost Walker, a shadowy figure whose very mention caused fear to spread like wildfire across the frontier. Not even Thomas knew. The morning passed in peaceful routine. Sarah tended to the chickens, while Thomas helped Elijah repair a broken wagon wheel. The old ranch hand had been with them since Thomas was born, a silent guardian whose loyalty to Sarah ran deeper than employment. It was approaching noon when Sarah noticed the dust cloud on the horizon. She straightened hand, instinctively moving to her hip where a gun should have been, would have been in another life. 12 years without drawing a weapon had not dulled her instincts. "Elijah," she called, voice level but tight, "take Thomas inside." The old man looked up, following her gaze to the approaching riders. His expression hardened as he gripped Thomas by the shoulder. "Come on, boy." "And what is it?" Thomas asked, squinting at the distant figures. "Just do as your mother says," Elijah replied, ushering him toward the house. Sarah stood her ground as 6 riders approached, spread in a practice formation that spoke of military training. They didn't gallop in wildly, didn't fire warning shots, didn't shout threats. And somehow that controlled approach terrified her more than any show of aggression. The leader rode a few paces ahead, a tall man with a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. His black coat was free of dust, despite the long ride, and the gun at his hip looked more like a surgeon's tool than a weapon of violence. The riders stopped 20 paces from where Sarah stood. No one spoke for a long moment. "Mrs. Blackwood," the man finally said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "My name is Frank Raven." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She knew that name, had heard Ghostwalker mention it once with a mixture of regret and disappointment. "You have the wrong house," she said evenly. "We're simple folk here." Frank Raven smiled, the expression never touching his eyes. "We both know that's not true." Ghost's shadow. The name hit her like a physical blow. No one had called her that in 12 years. No one alive should even know it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Then perhaps I should speak with your husband," Frank suggested, glancing toward the house. "Daniel Blackwood, isn't it?" "Oh, wait," his smile widened. "He's been dead 5 years now. Tragic accident in the mines, if I recall correctly." Sarah's hands curled into fists. "What do you want?" "What Ghost took from me," Frank replied simply. The black book. Behind her, the door creaked open. Sarah's heart sank as she heard Thomas's voice. Ma, is everything all right? What happened next unfolded with terrible efficiency. Frank's men dismounted without a word, spreading out across the property. Two headed for the grain silo with torches already lit. Another approached the well. The remaining two advanced toward the house. Please, Sarah said, stepping forward. Whatever you want, leave my son out of it. Frank regarded her with clinical interest. You have until sundown tomorrow to bring me the book. Otherwise, he gestured to his men. The grain silo erupted in flames. From inside the house came the sound of a struggle, followed by Elijah's pained shout. Sarah lunged forward, but two men seized her arms, forcing her to her knees. Bring the boy! Frank ordered. Thomas was dragged out, kicking and fighting with a ferocity that might have made Sarah proud under different circumstances. Elijah followed, stumbling and bleeding from a gash on his forehead. Take them to town, Frank said. Let everyone see. The main street of Redemption Creek fell silent as Frank Raven's men paraded Sarah and Thomas through town, forcing them to kneel in the dusty street outside the sheriff's office. Elijah was thrown beside them, barely conscious. Windows closed, doors shut. People who had greeted Sarah warmly for years now averted their eyes, retreating into their homes like shadows at noon. Frank dismounted, walking a slow circle around Sarah. 12 years ago, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, a woman with remarkable skills disappeared from the frontier. Around the same time, a widow named Sarah appeared in Redemption Creek with a young child. He stopped in front of her. Quite a coincidence. Sarah kept her eyes on Thomas, willing him to stay calm, to not do anything rash. I know you were Ghost's student, Frank continued, and I know he hid what I'm looking for. Right here on your land. He crouched down, bringing his face level with Sarah's. The black book contains names, dates, payments, evidence that would destroy powerful men who've paid me handsomely to recover it. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah repeated, each word deliberate. Frank's hand shot out, gripping her chin. Don't insult my intelligence. Ghost taught you everything, his only student who survived the training. His voice dropped to a whisper. Did he also teach you how to live with betrayal? He released her and stood nodding to his men. Two of them grabbed Thomas, dragging him toward their horses. No! Sarah lunged forward, only to be struck down by the butt of a rifle. You have until sundown tomorrow, Frank announced. Bring the book to Devil's Canyon. Come alone. He mounted his horse and looked down at her with something like pity. If you don't, I'll let the march write his own epitaph. As they rode away with Thomas, Sarah crawled to Elijah's side. The old man's breathing was labored, his eyes unfocused. Elijah, she whispered, stay with me. He gripped her hand with surprising strength. Sarah, the cave. He doesn't want the book. What do you mean? Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth as he struggled to speak. He wants the truth buried there. She looked up at the empty street, at the faces watching from behind curtains and shuttered windows. People she had lived among for 12 years. People who now knew she had been living a lie. Sarah helped Elijah to his feet. Can you walk? He nodded weakly. Where are we going? To get help, she said grimly. The sheriff's office door was locked when Sarah reached it. She pounded on it with her fist. Sheriff Wilson, I need your help. After a long moment, the door opened a crack. The sheriff, a man who had shared countless dinners at her table, regarded her with wary eyes. Sarah, he said, not meeting her gaze. I'm sorry about your boy. Then help me, she urged. Frank Raven kidnapped my son. You're the law here. Sheriff Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Frank Raven isn't someone I can touch. He works for people beyond my jurisdiction. So you'll do nothing? Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I always liked you despite not knowing who you really were. The sheriff began to close the door. My advice, give him what he wants. Sarah jammed her boot in the doorway. And if I don't have it, the sheriff's eyes finally met hers, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. Then God help you, because no one else will. With Elijah leaning heavily against her, Sarah made her way to the church at the edge of town. The small white building had always been a place of solace, and Pastor Michael had been a friend to her family since they arrived. But when she knocked, there was no answer. Through the window, she could see the pastor inside, sitting with his head in his hands. Pastor Michael, she called, please, I need your help. After a long moment, his silhouette appeared at the door, but it remained closed. "I can't help you, Sarah," came his muffled voice. "Not with this." "They took Thomas," she pleaded. "My son, a child you've known since he was 7 years old." "You brought this on yourself," the pastor replied, his voice shaking. "When you follow Ghost Walker, you chose this path." The name sent a chill through her. "How do you know that name?" Silence stretched between them. Finally, the pastor spoke again, his words barely audible through the door. "Everyone has secrets, Sarah, even in a town like this." A pause. "Especially in a town like this." She stepped back, stunned by the implications. "What do you know about Ghost?" "Leave Redemption Creek," the pastor said, instead of answering. "For your son's sake, give Frank what he wants and never come back." Back at the homestead, Sarah laid Elijah on his bed. His breathing had grown more labored, his skin clammy with sweat. She cleaned his wounds and gave him water, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. "Sarah," he whispered as she bathed his forehead. "The cave, behind the waterfall." "I know about the cave," she said, "but I don't know what's in it. Ghost never told me about any black book." Elijah's eyes flickered open, surprisingly clear despite his pain. "Not just a book. The truth." "What truth?" The old man's hand found hers, gripping it weakly. "About who Ghost really was. About what happened in this town 15 years ago." He coughed, blood speckling his lips. "About why Daniel really died." Sarah felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. "Daniel died in a mining accident." Elijah shook his head slightly. "Nothing in Redemption Creek happens by accident." His eyes drifted closed, his breathing becoming shallow. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Elijah, stay with me. I need to know what you mean." But the old man had slipped into unconsciousness, hovering between life and death. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. The pastor's words echoed in her head. "Everyone has secrets, Sarah, even in a town like this." What had Ghost hidden in the cave? What connection did it have to Daniel's death? And how did Frank Raven know about her past? She moved to the fireplace and pried loose a stone from the hearth. Behind it was a small space containing a wooden box. She hadn't opened it in 12 years. Inside lay a pair of revolvers meticulously maintained despite their years of disuse. She ran her fingers over the intricate Ghost design etched into the handles, a gift from her mentor when she completed her training. Sarah Blackwood had vowed never to touch a gun again after she left her old life behind. But Sarah Blackwood's son had been taken, and Ghost's shadow was about to return. Night had fallen by the time Sarah finished her preparations. She dressed in black, the color of her former life, and strapped on the guns that had once been extensions of her own hands. She checked on Elijah one last time. His condition hadn't improved, but he was stable for now. She left water medicine in a note by his bedside explaining where she had gone. The cave behind the waterfall held answers she needed, but Thomas was her priority. Devil's Canyon was a half-day's ride to the north, and Frank had given her until sundown tomorrow. Time enough to seek help first. Sarah mounted her horse and took one last look at the homestead, the life she had built from nothing, now crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. Then she turned and rode into the darkness, leaving Redemption Creek behind. As she crested the hill overlooking the town, she saw movement on the road ahead, a lone rider approaching. Sarah drew her gun with a speed that surprised even her muscle memory, returning, as if the years of peaceful existence had been nothing but a brief intermission. "Stop right there," she called out. "Identify yourself." The rider halted, raising both hands. "It's Marcus Ford, Sarah, Daniel's old friend." Sarah kept her gun leveled. "What are you doing out here, Marcus?" He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "I heard about what happened in town. Word travels fast." "And you came to help," Sarah's tone made it clear how unlikely she found that possibility. Marcus Ford had once been Daniel's closest friend, a fellow miner with dreams of striking it rich. But after Daniel's death, Marcus had spiraled into drink and despair, eventually drifting to a neighboring town where rumors said he spent his days in a whiskey haze. "I came because—" Marcus hesitated, lowering his hands. "Because I owe it to Daniel." Sarah studied him in the moonlight. He looked older than his 35 years, his once handsome face now lined and gaunt. His clothes were worn but clean, and his eyes, though sunken, were clear of the alcoholic glaze she remembered. "Get back on your horse and go home, Marcus," she said, finally lowering her gun. "This isn't your fight." "They took Thomas," he replied simply. "Daniel's son. That makes it my fight." Sarah felt a flicker of something not quite trust, but perhaps hope. I'm going after Frank Raven. It's going to get ugly. Marcus nodded. I figured as much when I saw you wearing those. Madna, he gestured to her guns. Never thought I'd see Ghost Shadow ride again. She stiffened. How do you know that name? A sad smile crossed his face. Daniel told me who you really were the night before he died. Marcus met her gaze steadily. He was proud of you, Sarah. Proud that you'd left that life behind for him and Thomas. The mention of her late husband sent a pang through her heart. Daniel is gone, and if I don't do something, Thomas will be too. Then let me help, Marcus insisted. I know where Frank Raven's men drink when they're in these parts. We might be able to extract some information before you face him directly. Sarah considered her options. Going against Frank alone would be suicide, and time was not on her side. Having someone who knew the terrain and potentially had useful information could make the difference. One condition, she said finally. You follow my lead without question. This isn't a revenge mission or a chance to play hero. It's about bringing my son home. Marcus nodded solemnly. I understand. Then let's ride, Shura said, turning her horse north. We have until sundown tomorrow to save Thomas. As they rode side by side under the vast expanse of stars, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus wasn't telling her everything. But right now, she needed allies, even uncertain ones. What she didn't need were the memories that kept surfacing. Memories of Ghostwalker's training, of the life she had fought so hard to leave behind. Memories of the day she had made the decision that set all of this in motion. The decision that had earned her the name Ghost Shadow, and perhaps ultimately led to her son's kidnapping 12 years later. The first rule Ghost Walker had told her is to never become attached to anyone or anything. Attachment is a tether that will be used to control you. They had been standing on a cliff overlooking a vast canyon similar to the one she now rode toward. She had been young then, barely 20, with fire in her veins and revenge in her heart after Outlaws killed her family. The second rule is to trust no one completely, not even me. Ghost had been a legend, even then a specter that haunted the nightmares of corrupt officials and outlaws alike. No one knew his real name or face, only that he appeared when justice failed, exacting retribution with terrifying precision. Taking her as his student had broken his own code. He never explained why he chose her, only that he saw something in her eyes that reminded him of himself. And the third rule, most important of all, know why you kill. If you don't have a reason beyond money or orders, you're nothing but a common murderer. Sarah had trained under Ghostwalker for 3 years, learning to move like a shadow, to read people's intentions, from the smallest gestures to kill with a gun, a knife, or her bare hands if necessary. But in the end, she had broken all 3 rules. She had become attached to Daniel, to the idea of a normal life. She had trusted completely both Ghost and Daniel in different ways. And she had killed without truly understanding why, following Ghost's instructions, without questioning the greater purpose. Until the day she discovered the truth. The day everything changed. The memory faded as they approached a small town nestled in a valley. Lantern lights spilled from a saloon at the edge of town, raucous laughter carrying on the night air. Sutton's Creek, Marcus explained. No law to speak of. Perfect place for men like Raven's crew to unwind. Sarah studied the small settlement, a dozen buildings clustered around a dusty main street. How do you know his men come here? Marcus's expression darkened. Because I've been watching them. Ever since I heard rumors that Frank Raven was looking for Ghostwalker's student. He gave her a sidelong glance. I've been tracking his movements for months, trying to warn you. Why didn't you? Sarah asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. I did, Marcus replied grimly. I sent a letter 3 months ago. I'm guessing you never received it. Sarah remembered the unusual behavior of Redemption Creek's postmaster in recent weeks. His avoidance of her gaze, his nervous demeanor whenever she collected her mail. More secrets, she murmured. This town is buried in them. They left their horses at a small stable and approached the saloon on foot. Sarah removed her distinctive guns, hiding them under her long coat, and pulled her hat low over her eyes. Let me do the talking, Marcus said as they reached the swinging doors. These men know me as a drunk with a grudge against the world. They won't see me as a threat. Sarah nodded, though everything in her rebelled against relinquishing control. Remember, we're here for information, not a fight. Information first, Marcus agreed, but I'm not ruling out a fight if it comes to it. They pushed through the doors into a haze of smoke and whiskey fumes. The saloon was crowded but not packed, with most patrons clustered around card tables or the long bar. In the corner, a group of 5 men sat apart from the others. Even without the distinctive black bandanas tied around their arms, Sarah would have marked them as Raven's men. They carried themselves with the same disciplined alertness she had seen in Frank's posture. "There," she murmured to Marcus, "the table in the corner." Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, then adopted the slouched posture and unsteady gait of a man well into his cups. Sarah followed a few paces behind, her eyes constantly scanning the room. As they passed the men's table, Marcus stumbled accidentally on purpose, knocking into one of Raven's crew. "Watch where you're going, fool," the man growled, shoving Marcus back. "My apologies, sir," Marcus slurred, throwing an arm around the man's shoulder in apparent drunken camaraderie. "Let me buy you a drink to make amends." The other men at the table tensed, hands moving subtly toward weapons. Sarah positioned herself where she could watch them all, ready to move if necessary. "Get lost, Ford," another man said. "We've got business to discuss." Marcus raised his eyebrows in exaggerated surprise. "You know my name, I'm flattered." He leaned in conspiratorially. "And what business might that be?" "Something to do with that commotion over in Redemption Creek today." The first man shrugged Marcus's arm off roughly. "That's none of your concern." "Maybe not," Marcus agreed, swaying slightly. "But I heard it involved the Blackwood boy. Daniel was my friend, you know. Best damn friend I ever had." A flicker of unease passed between the men. One of them, a lean, hard-faced individual with a scar running down his cheek, studied Marcus more carefully. "You're not as drunk as you're pretending to be," he observed quietly. "And your friend there is watching us like a hawk." He nodded toward Sarah. "Who's she?" Sarah cursed inwardly. These weren't ordinary thugs. Marcus straightened, dropping the drunk act. "Someone who wants to know where Frank Raven is keeping the boy." The scarred man smiled without humor. "You've got courage, I'll give you that." His hand moved to his gun, but not much sense. Sarah tensed, ready to draw. But movement at the saloon entrance caught her attention. 3 more men entered, wearing the same black bandanas as the others. They were outnumbered 8-2. "Last chance," Marcus said, his voice hard now. "Tell us where the boy is, and we walk away." The scarred man's smile widened. "Or what?" In answer, Marcus drove his fist into the man's face with surprising speed. Chaos erupted instantly. Chairs overturned, glasses shattered, and patrons scrambled for the exits. Sarah moved with the fluid grace that had once made her legend, drawing her guns and firing in one smooth motion. 2 of Raven's men fell before they could clear their holsters, but the others were diving for cover, returning fire. A bullet grazed her arm as she rolled behind the bar, pain flaring hot against her skin. She heard Marcus grunt in pain somewhere to her left. "Marcus," she called. "I'm all right," came his strained reply. "Just winged me." Sarah peered over the edge of the bar, counted the remaining opponents, 6, including the scarred man who was now bleeding from a gash on his forehead. "Give up, Shadow," he called. "We've got you pinned down." The use of her old name confirmed her suspicions. These weren't just hired guns, they knew exactly who she was. "You and your men are dead men walking," she replied calmly, "unless you tell me where my son is." With laughter greeted her words. "You've been playing house too long," the scarred man taunted. "The Shadow I heard about wouldn't be trapped behind a bar making empty threats." Something cold and familiar settled in Sarah's chest, a detachment she hadn't felt in 12 years. Ghostwalker had taught her to embrace that coldness, to let it sharpen her senses when fear would dull them. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, she was no longer Sarah Blackwood. She was Ghost Shadow. Without warning, she fired twice into the ceiling, hitting the chains that held the large oil lamp suspended above the main room. The lamp crashed down, plunging the saloon into near darkness as oil spread and ignited. In the confusion, Sarah moved like water, silent and deadly. The first man never saw her coming. She was simply there behind him, her gun pressed to his spine before she fired. The second managed to turn, eyes widening in the firelight before her bullet found his heart. Marcus had recovered enough to join the fight, taking down another of Raven's men with a well-placed shot. The scarred man fired wildly into the spreading darkness, a panic evident in his voice as he shouted, "Where are you?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "I'm the Shadow at your back, the ghost in your nightmares." She materialized behind him, her gun pressed to his head. "Now tell me where my son is." The man trembled, dropping his weapon. "Devil's Canyon," he gasped. "In the old mining camp. But you'll never get to him. There are too many." "How many?" Sarah pressed the gun harder against his skull. 15, maybe 20. Frank's best men. The scarred man was sweating profusely now. "They're expecting you. It's a trap." "I know," Sarah replied softly. But now they're expecting Sarah Blackwood. She leaned closer, her whisper chilling. "Not Ghost Shadow." She brought the butt of her gun down, knocking the man unconscious. Then she scanned the burning saloon for Marcus, finding him leaning against a table, clutching his side. "We need to go," she said, helping him up. "This place is about to become a pyre." They stumbled out into the night air as flames engulfed the saloon behind them. In the distance, they could hear shouts as the town's residents organized to fight the fire. Sarah helped Marcus to the stable where they had left their horses. His wound was worse than he had admitted. A bullet had caught him in the side and blood was soaking through his shirt. "You need a doctor," she said, examining the wound. Marcus shook his head. No time. Devil's Canyon is a 4-hour ride from here. If we leave now, we can be there by dawn." "You're in no condition to ride," Sarah argued. "And you're in no position to face 20 men alone," he countered, grimacing as he pulled himself into the saddle. "I've come this far. I'm seeing it through." Sarah wanted to protest further, but knew he was right. Even with her skills, the odds were overwhelming, without help. As they rode away from the burning saloon, one of the wounded men stirred, pulling himself to his knees. Blood bubbled from his lips as he watched the two riders disappear into the night. "I thought only ghosts move that fast," he whispered to the empty air. Then he collapsed, a small leather-bound journal falling from his pocket onto the blood-soaked earth. Dawn was breaking as Sarah and Marcus approached Devil's Canyon, a jagged scar in the earth where rumors said the devil himself had dragged his claws across the land in anger. They had stopped briefly to tend to Marcus's wound, which had slowed its bleeding but still clearly caused him pain with every movement. Despite Sarah's concerns, he had insisted on continuing his determination, a mystery she had no time to unravel. They dismounted at the canyon's edge, tethering their horses to a twisted juniper tree. Below, they could see the abandoned mining camp, a cluster of dilapidated wooden structures nestled against the canyon wall. Thin wisps of smoke rose from a few locations, and figures moved between the buildings. "I count 12 men on watch," Sarah murmured, scanning the camp through a spyglass. "Probably more inside." Marcus nodded grimly. "The main building there?" He pointed to a larger structure at the camp's center. "That's where they'll be keeping Thomas." "How do you know?" Sarah asked, her suspicion returning. Marcus hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. Finally, he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather-bound journal, the same one that had fallen from the dying outlaw's pocket. "I found this when we were leaving the saloon," he explained it, handing it to her. "It's a record of operations, including this one." Sarah flipped through the pages, her blood running cold as she read. The journal contained names, dates, payment amounts, a detailed account of Ghostwalker's activities over the years. But more disturbing were the names of those who had hired him, including Pastor Michael of Redemption Creek and Daniel. She whispered, her hand trembling as she read her late husband's name. "This can't be right." Marcus wouldn't meet her gaze. "I'm sorry, Sarah." She stared at him, realization dawning. "You knew, all this time you knew what Daniel was involved in." His silence was confirmation enough. "Ghostwalker wasn't just an assassin," Sarah said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "He was cleaning up after corrupt officials, businessmen, and Daniel was part of it." Marcus finally looked at her, his eyes haunted. "Daniel wasn't who you thought he was, Sarah. Neither was your mentor. And why should I believe you?" Her hand moved to her gun. "Because I was there," Marcus replied, his voice breaking. "I watched Daniel order Ghost to eliminate an entire family because the father was a journalist who threatened to expose corruption in the mining company." The world seemed to tilt around Sarah. "No, Daniel was a good man. He saved me when I needed saving." "Did he?" Marcus asked quietly. "Or did he just see an opportunity to control Ghost's deadliest student?" Before Sarah could respond, movement in the canyon below caught her attention. A group of riders was approaching the camp, Frank Raven at their head. "We're out of time," she said, pushing her confusion and anger aside. "This changes nothing about Thomas. He's innocent in all this." Marcus nodded, wincing as he checked his gun. "What's the plan?" Sarah studied the camp layout, formulating a strategy. "We can't go in guns blazing. There are too many of them, and they might hurt Thomas if they see us coming. She pointed to a narrow trail winding down the canyon wall. I'll go down that way, approach from the south where their visibility is weakest. You stay here and provide cover fire if things go wrong. Marcus frowned. That's suicide, Sarah. You need me down there with you. You can barely stand, she countered, and I need someone I can trust watching my back from up here. The irony of her words wasn't lost on her. Trust was now a dangerous commodity. After a moment, Marcus nodded reluctantly. I'll give you an hour to get into position. If I don't see any sign of you by then, I'll start picking them off to create a diversion. Sarah checked her guns one last time, then turned to Marcus. If something happens to me, get Thomas out. Take him somewhere safe, away from all this. I promise, he said solemnly. As Sarah began her descent into the canyon, the weight of what she had learned pressed down on her like a physical burden. If what Marcus said was true, if Daniel had been working with Ghost all along, then her entire life for the past 12 years had been built on lies. And somewhere in a cave behind a waterfall lay the full truth hidden by Ghostwalker himself. But first she had to save her son. The canyon walls rose around her as she made her way down the narrow trail, each step taking her closer to a confrontation that would either reunite her with Thomas or end with both their deaths. Either way, Sarah Blackwood Ghost's shadow was about to face her past, and the reckoning would be written in blood. The descent into Devil's Canyon was treacherous, loose rocks skittering beneath Sarah's boots as she navigated the narrow path. Twice she nearly lost her footing, saved only by reflexes honed through years of training. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the canyon walls and eliminating the cover of darkness she would have preferred. Sarah paused behind a large boulder studying the mining camp below. It was larger than it had appeared from the rim, a dozen weathered structures scattered around what had once been the main shaft. Men with rifles patrolled the perimeter in pairs, moving with military precision that confirmed these weren't ordinary outlaws. Frank Raven had disappeared into the largest building at the center of the camp. If Marcus's information was correct, that's where they were holding Thomas. Sarah closed her eyes, centering herself. Ghostwalker's voice echoed in her memory. Fear and anger cloud judgment. Breathe them away. Become empty. Only then can you move undetected. When she opened her eyes again, her emotions were locked away, her mind clear and focused. She began her approach using the scattered boulders and abandoned mining equipment for cover. The first guard never knew she was there. Sarah emerged from his blind spot like a wisp of smoke, one hand clamping over his mouth, while the other drove a knife between his ribs with surgical precision. She lowered his body silently, dragging it behind a pile of discarded timbers. The second guard turned at the wrong moment, catching a glimpse of movement. His hand moved to his gun, but Sarah was faster, her thrown knife embedding itself in his throat before he could shout a warning. She retrieved both knives, wiping them clean before continuing her advance. By the time she reached the edge of the camp, 3 more of Raven's men lay dead, their bodies hidden from casual view. But she was still outnumbered, with at least 15 men remaining, and now she had to cross open ground to reach the main building. Sarah studied the patrol patterns, calculating intervals and blind spots. There was a narrow window, perhaps 10 seconds, when the southeast corner of the main building would be uncovered. She would have to time her movement perfectly. As she prepared to make her dash, a commotion erupted on the far side of the camp. Gunshots rang out, followed by shouts of alarm. Guards ran toward the disturbance, abandoning their posts. Marcus had decided not to wait the full hour. Sarah seized the opportunity, sprinting across the open ground and flattening herself against the wall of the main building. She edged toward a dirty window, peering cautiously inside. What she saw made her blood run cold. Thomas was tied to a chair in the center of the room, his face bruised, but his eyes defiant. Frank Raven paced around him, speaking too quietly for Sarah to hear through the glass. 4 armed men stood guard at strategic points in the room. And in the corner, tied to another chair, was a young girl, perhaps 14 years old, terrified and crying silently. Sarah hadn't anticipated a second hostage. It complicated matters significantly. The distraction Marcus had created wouldn't last long. She needed to act now while most of the guards were occupied. Sarah moved to the door, testing it gently. Unlocked. Taking a deep breath, she threw the door open and rolled inside, guns drawn. 2 guards fell before they could react, precise shots dropping them where they stood. The third managed to fire his bullet, grazing Sarah's shoulder as her own shot found his heart. The 4th guard grabbed Thomas, pressing a gun to the boy's head. "Drop them," he shouted, or the kid dies. Sarah froze, her gun still aimed. Frank Raven remarkably hadn't moved, standing calmly beside the girl's chair, watching the scene unfold with clinical interest. "Hello, Shadow," he said pleasantly, as if greeting an old friend. "Right on schedule." "Let them go," Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet. "This is between you and me." Frank smiled. "Said I'm not so sure." He placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, causing her to flinch. "You see, everyone in this room is connected by a tangled web of lies and betrayal. Even young Thomas here, though he doesn't know it yet." The boy's eyes found Sarah's confusion and fear warring on his face. "Ma, it's going to be all right, Thomas," she assured him, never taking her eyes off Frank. "I'm taking you home." Frank laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Home to Redemption Creek, that town was built on blood money and secrets. Ghost didn't choose it randomly when he hid the book there. "I don't have what you want," Sarah said. "I never did." "I believe you," Frank replied, surprising her. Ghost wouldn't have trusted anyone with a location, not even his prize student. His eyes narrowed. "But you know who might?" "The old man Elijah." Sarah struggled to keep her expression neutral. "How much did Frank know? Elijah is just a ranch hand," she said. "He has nothing to do with this." "Oh, but he does." Frank moved away from the girl, circling Thomas slowly. "Elijah was Ghost's right hand for 20 years before he became your, what did you call him, ranch hand?" The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Elijah had known Ghost, had worked with him all these years, living under her roof, watching Thomas grow up. "You're lying," she said, but the doubt had crept into her voice. "Am I?" Frank stopped behind Thomas, placing both hands on the boy's shoulders. "Ask yourself why Ghost would send you to Redemption Creek after you betrayed him. Why Daniel Blackwood just happened to be there to save you. Why Elijah appeared shortly after offering his services." Sarah's mind raced. It couldn't be true, and yet it would explain so much. "Ghost isn't dead, is he?" she asked quietly. Frank's expression darkened. "Oh, he's dead, all right. Shot in the back by his most trusted student." His gaze bored into her. "But not by you." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Someone betrayed him first." "Very good." Frank nodded approvingly. "And when that person failed to find the book, they waited for you to lead them to it." The fourth guard still held his gun to Thomas's head, but his attention had drifted to the conversation. Sarah noted the slight relaxation in his posture, the minuscule shift in his aim. "So who was it?" she asked, keeping Frank engaged while she calculated angles and timing. "Who betrayed Ghost first?" "Someone who stood to lose everything if the book was made public," Frank replied. "Someone who—" A gunshot from outside interrupted him, closer than the earlier distraction. Frank's head turned slightly toward the sound. It was all the opening Sarah needed. She moved with blinding speed, her left gun firing at the guard holding Thomas, the bullet striking his wrist with pinpoint accuracy. As he screamed and dropped his weapon, Sarah was already diving forward, tackling Thomas's chair to the ground as gunfire erupted. Frank drew with impressive speed, but Sarah was faster, her right-hand gun tracking and firing in one fluid motion. Frank grunted as the bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him halfway around. More shots came from the doorway. Marcus had arrived, providing covering fire as Sarah cut Thomas free with her knife. "Get the girl," she shouted to him over the chaos. Marcus limped into the room, firing steadily at Frank, who had taken cover behind an overturned table. He reached the young girl, slicing through her bonds and pulling her toward the exit. Sarah helped Thomas to his feet. "Stay low," she instructed, pushing him toward Marcus. "Go with him. I'll be right behind you." "But Ma—" "Go," she insisted, turning back to face Frank. The injured man was reloading, blood soaking his shirt from the shoulder wound. "You've improved," he called out. "Ghost would be proud." "You don't know anything about Ghost," Sarah replied, advancing cautiously. Frank smiled through gritted teeth. "I know he considered you his greatest achievement and his greatest mistake." He finished reloading the gun, steady despite his injury. "I know he regretted not killing you when he had the chance." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. "Why are you really here, Frank? What's in that book that's worth all this?" "The truth," he replied simply. "About Ghost, about Redemption Creek, about what happened to that child you rescued all those years ago." Sarah froze. "What child?" Frank's smile widened. "You really don't know, do you?" He nodded toward the door where Thomas had just exited. "Ask yourself why Ghost sent you on that last mission. Why out of all his students, you were the only one he trusted to extract that particular target. A terrible suspicion began to form in Sarah's mind. Thomas was never Daniel's son, Frank confirmed. He was the child you rescued from that burning compound 12 years ago. The last living witness to a massacre orchestrated by the very men who now rule Redemption Creek. The world seemed to tilt around Sarah. Thomas wasn't Daniel's son, wasn't her son. You're lying, she whispered. Am I? Frank chuckled. Ghost knew you couldn't complete the mission and remain the person you were, so he gave you a choice, your old life or a new one with the boy. He arranged everything, including Daniel Blackwood as your husband. Sarah's hand trembled slightly. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand what you're fighting for. Frank's expression hardened. That book doesn't just contain names and payments. It contains evidence of crimes committed by powerful men across 3 territories, evidence gathered by Ghost over decades. Outside, the gunfire was intensifying. They were running out of time. And you want to destroy it, Sarah concluded. Frank laughed a genuine surprised laugh. Destroy it? No, I want to publish it. He gestured to his wound with his free hand. These men, the ones trying to kill us, they work for the people named in that book. The same people who hired me years ago then betrayed me when I refused to bury the truth. Sarah's mind raced, trying to separate truth from manipulation. If you're so righteous, why take Thomas? Why threaten an innocent boy? Because I needed to flush you out, Frank admitted. And because he's not just any boy. He's the son of Governor Williams, the man who ordered the massacre of his own illegitimate family to protect his reputation. The pieces were falling into place now. Horrible, jagged pieces that cut as they connected. The girl, Sarah said suddenly. Who is she? Insurance, Frank replied grimly. Marcus Ford's daughter. Before Sarah could process this new revelation, the building shook as something exploded nearby. Dust rained from the ceiling. We're out of time, Frank said, lowering his gun slightly. They're coming to clean up their mess, all of us included. Sarah kept her weapon trained on him. Give me one reason not to put a bullet in you right now. Because I'm the only one besides Elijah who knows where Ghost hid the cave key. Frank met her gaze steadily. Kill me, and the truth stays buried forever. Another explosion closer this time. The walls trembled. Sarah made her decision. Get up, slowly. Frank complied, keeping his wounded arm close to his body. What now? Now we leave together. Sarah gestured toward the back door with her gun. After you. They emerged into chaos. Several buildings were ablaze and gunfire echoed throughout the canyon. Frank led Sarah to a small shed behind the main structure, pausing to check for guards before dashing across the open space. Inside the shed, Frank moved a stack of crates, revealing a trap door. Old ventilation shaft, he explained, pulling it open. Comes out half a mile down the canyon. Sarah kept her gun on him. You first. Frank grimaced but lowered himself into the hole. Sarah followed, pulling the trap door closed above them. The tunnel was narrow and stifling, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through near total darkness. Sarah kept one hand on Frank's boot, unwilling to let him get too far ahead in the blackness. Why should I believe anything you've told me? She asked as they crawled. For all I know, you're leading me into another trap. If I wanted you dead, I'd have let those men do it, Frank replied, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. I've spent 5 years tracking Ghost's legacy, trying to finish what he started. Which was what exactly? Justice, Frank said simply. Real justice, not the kind that can be bought and sold by men with money and power. They continued in silence for several minutes, the sounds of gunfire growing more distant. Finally, Frank stopped. Here's the exit, he said, pushing upward on what appeared to be a rusted metal plate. Sunlight streamed in as the plate moved aside. Frank pulled himself out, then reached down to help Sarah. She ignored his offered hand, emerging warily into the daylight with her gun still ready. They stood in a dry stream bed, the canyon walls rising on either side. There was no sign of pursuit yet, but dust clouds in the distance suggested riders approaching. Marcus should have taken the main trail with the children, Frank said, scanning the horizon. If they made it out, they'll head for the rendezvous point. Which is where? Sarah demanded. The old church in Copper Springs, Frank replied. About 10 miles east of here. Sarah studied him, trying to read past the pain and exhaustion on his face. You planned this entire scenario, didn't you? Getting captured, using me to escape. Frank shrugged, then winced at the movement. I had several plans. This wasn't the first choice, but it's working so far. And Marcus, is he really working with you, or was that part of your plan too? A complex emotion crossed Frank's face. Marcus Ford has his own motivations. I wouldn't call him an ally exactly. His daughter, Sarah remembered. The girl in there, Sarah. Emma, Frank nodded, taken 3 days ago from their home in Willowbrook. By you, Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. No, Frank shook his head. By the same men who are hunting us now. I was trying to rescue her when I was captured. The story was becoming increasingly tangled with loyalties and betrayals overlapping in ways Sarah couldn't fully unravel. One thing was becoming clear, however, nothing was as simple as it had first appeared. We need to move, Frank said, glancing nervously at the dust clouds. Those riders will be here soon. Sarah nodded reluctantly. Lead the way. But remember, I'm watching you. I'd expect nothing less from Ghost's shadow, Frank replied with a hint of grudging respect. They made their way through the canyon, following the stream bed until it joined a larger wash that eventually led them out of the confined space. Frank's wound was clearly paining him, but he maintained a steady pace, stopping only once to rebind it with a strip torn from his shirt. So Ghost is really dead, Sarah said, as they paused in the shadow of a large boulder. It wasn't a question. Frank nodded grimly. Shot in the back while reading by the fire. No warning, no chance to defend himself. When 3 years ago, Frank replied, shortly after Daniel Blackwood's accident in the mines. Sarah processed this information, adding it to the growing collection of disturbing revelations. And you believe Elijah knows who did it? I know he does. Frank's certainty was chilling. Elijah was there that night. He witnessed everything. Then why didn't he tell me? Sarah's voice hardened. He's lived under my roof for years, watched Thomas grow up. Protection, perhaps, Frank suggested. Or waiting for the right moment. Ghost always said Elijah played the longest game of anyone he knew. They continued walking, the sun beating down mercilessly. In the distance, the faint outline of buildings appeared. Copper Springs, their destination. You still haven't explained why you became Ghost's student if you're so dedicated to justice, Sarah said, breaking the silence. He was an assassin, not a lawman. Frank was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if recalling events from another lifetime. I was a Pinkerton agent, he began. Young, idealistic, convinced I was on the right side of the law. Then I was assigned to investigate a series of deaths among mining executives in Montana Territory. He glanced at Sarah. Ghost's work, as you probably guessed. And you tracked him down, Sarah prompted when he paused. I tried, Frank corrected. Instead, he found me. Could have killed me easily, but he didn't. He showed me what those executives had done. Entire towns poisoned by mine runoff workers killed for trying to organize judges, and lawmen bribed to look the other way. Sarah could hear the genuine emotion in his voice, not something easily faked. Ghost offered me a choice, Frank continued. Continue serving a corrupt system or help him bring a different kind of justice. I chose the latter. But he didn't take you as a student, Sarah observed. No. Frank acknowledged a hint of old bitterness creeping into his tone. He already had his prodigy, you. I never asked for that role, Sarah said quietly. Few of us ask for our destinies, Frank replied. We just try to live with them afterward. They walked in silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts. The town of Copper Springs grew larger on the horizon, a collection of weathered buildings surrounding a small church with a leaning steeple. What if Thomas isn't there? Sarah asked suddenly. What if Marcus took him somewhere else? Then we keep searching, Frank answered simply. Ghost taught me one valuable lesson before he rejected me as a student: never abandon an innocent caught in the crossfire. It was something Ghost had taught Sarah as well, though she had believed she was the only one to receive such instruction. Another certainty crumbling to dust. As they approached the outskirts of Copper Springs, Sarah's hand moved back to her gun. The town appeared deserted, no smoke from chimneys, no movement in the streets. I don't like this, she murmured. Frank nodded, his own posture tensing. Too quiet. They advanced cautiously, using the abandoned buildings for cover as they made their way toward the church. Its doors stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. An invitation or a trap, Sarah couldn't tell. Wait here, she instructed, moving forward alone. Sarah, Frank called softly. When she turned, he offered her his second gun, just in case. She hesitated, then accepted the weapon with a nod of thanks. Trust was still a luxury she couldn't afford, but pragmatism demanded she take every advantage available. Sarah approached the church silently, keeping to the shadows. She paused at the entrance, listening intently. From inside came the faint sound of voices, one of them unmistakably Thomas's. Relief flooded through her, quickly tempered by caution. She slipped inside, guns ready. The church's interior was dim dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that penetrated the dirty windows. At the altar stood Marcus, his arm around his daughter Emma. Thomas sat in the front pew, his expression brightening when he saw Sarah. "Ma," he exclaimed, starting to rise. "Stay where you are, Thomas," Sarah instructed, her eyes fixed on Marcus. "Are you both all right?" Thomas nodded, though his gaze darted nervously between her and Marcus. "We're fine. Mr. Ford got us out through a back trail." Sarah moved slowly down the aisle, every sense alert for signs of deception or danger. "You cut it very close with that distraction, Marcus." He shrugged his arm, still around Emma's shoulders. "Timing was never my strong suit. But it worked, didn't it?" "That remains to be seen." Sarah stopped several paces away from them. "Frank told me something interesting about Emma. Said she was taken 3 days ago from your home in Willowbrook." Marcus tensed visibly. "Frank talks too much." "Is it true?" Sarah pressed. After a long moment, Marcus nodded, his expression haunted. "Yes, they took her to ensure my cooperation." "And what exactly were you supposed to do?" Marcus's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Trade you for my daughter." The admission hung in the air between them. Thomas looked between them, confusion evident on his face. "Mr. Ford," he questioned uncertainly. "I'm sorry, Thomas," Marcus said, genuine regret in his voice. "I never wanted you to get hurt. But when it comes to Emma, I'd sacrifice anyone, even you, even myself." Sarah understood that level of devotion all too well. It was what had driven her actions for the past 12 years. The revelation didn't surprise her as much as it should have. "And yet you helped us escape," she observed. "Plans change," Marcus replied cryptically. "When I saw what was in that journal, when I realized what Frank was really after," he shook his head. "Some secrets should stay buried, Sarah." A floorboard creaked behind her, Frank entering the church, his gun lowered but ready. "Not these secrets," he said firmly. "The world needs to know what happened in Redemption Creek 15 years ago." Sarah kept her position, able to watch both men without fully turning her back on either. "And what exactly did happen?" Frank and Marcus exchanged a long look, two men with a shared history Sarah was only beginning to glimpse. "Show her," Frank said finally. "Ustinam, show her the photograph." With reluctance, Marcus reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He extended it towards Sarah, who took it cautiously, unfolding it while keeping her peripheral vision on both men. It was a faded photograph of a group of men standing in front of Redemption Creek's town hall. Sarah recognized several faces: Pastor Michael Sheriff Wilson, a younger Daniel Blackwood. In the center stood a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, his hand resting on the shoulder of a young woman who was clearly with child. "Governor Williams," Frank explained, pointing to the central figure, "and his mistress, Katherine Johnson. This was taken 6 months before he ordered the compound burned with everyone inside." Sarah studied the photograph, her stomach tightening with dread. "And the child she was carrying." "Thomas," Frank confirmed softly. "The only survivor thanks to you." Sarah looked up at the boy sitting in the pew, the boy she had raised as her own for 12 years. Thomas stared back, his young face pale with shock. Is that true?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Before Sarah could answer, a barrage of gunfire erupted outside the church. Windows shattered as bullets tore through the aged wood of the walls. "Get down!" Sarah shouted, diving toward Thomas and pulling him to the floor. Marcus did the same with Emma, shielding her with his body as splinters flew around them. Frank had taken cover behind a heavy wooden pulpit, returning fire through a broken window. "They found us." "How many?" Sarah called, peering cautiously over a pew. "At least 10, maybe more," Frank replied grimly. "We're surrounded." Sarah's mind raced, assessing options. The church had only 2 exits: the front door and a small rear entrance near the altar. Both would be covered by gunmen. "Is there a cellar?" she asked Marcus. He nodded. "Behind the altar trap door under the rug." "That's our best chance," Sarah decided. "Frank, can you keep them busy while we get the children down there?" Frank nodded methodically, reloading his weapon. "Go, I'll cover you." Sarah turned to Thomas, whose eyes were wide with shock and fear. Stay low and move fast. Follow Marcus to the cellar entrance. Ma, are you coming? His voice trembled slightly. Right behind you, she promised. Now go. As Frank laid down, covering fire, Sarah, Thomas, Marcus, and Emma crawled toward the altar. Marcus pulled back a threadbare rug, revealing a wooden trapdoor with an iron ring handle. It leads to old mining tunnels, he explained, pulling it open. We can use them to escape. Emma went first, then Thomas, disappearing into the darkness below. Marcus paused at the entrance, looking back at Sarah. What I said before, he began, his expression troubled. About sacrificing anyone for Emma. I understand, Sarah cut him off. I'd have done the same for Thomas. Relief flickered across his face. Even if he's not really your son. The question struck her like a physical blow. He's been my son for 12 years, she replied fiercely. Nothing will ever change that. Marcus nodded, a strange sadness in his eyes. I hope he feels the same way when he learns the full truth. Before Sarah could question him further, a bullet splintered the altar inches from her head. She shoved Marcus toward the trapdoor. Go, I'll get Frank. Marcus hesitated, then disappeared into the cellar. Sarah turned back toward the front of the church. Frank, she called. Time to go. He fired several more shots, then began moving backward toward her position, staying low as bullets tore through the church around them. They're closing in, he warned as he reached her. We don't have much time. Sarah nodded toward the open trapdoor. After you. Frank glanced at the dark opening, then back at her with sudden suspicion. You first. A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. Neither of us fully trust the other, but we're out of options. After a moment's hesitation, Frank nodded and began lowering himself into the cellar. Sarah fired a few final shots to keep their attackers at bay, then followed him down, pulling the trap door closed above them. Darkness enveloped them completely. Sarah heard the breathing of the others nearby, sensed their movements in the blackness. Anyone have a towel light? Marcus's voice came from somewhere to her left. Here, Frank replied. There was the sound of a match striking, then a small flame illuminated his face. He touched it to a small lantern he produced from within his coat. The cellar was larger than Sarah had expected, a stone-walled chamber, with rough-hewn support beams and a packed dirt floor. At the far end, a dark tunnel mouth opened like a wound in the earth. That leads to the old Morning Star mine. Marcus explained, gesturing toward the tunnel. From there, we can reach a dozen different exits across the hillside. Will they follow us down here? Thomas asked, his voice steadier than Sarah had expected. Eventually, Frank replied grimly, but these tunnels are a maze unless you know them. We have a head start. Sarah reloaded her guns, counting her remaining ammunition. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but it would have to do. Let's move, she said. We can sort everything else out when we're safe. The group proceeded into the tunnel, Frank leading with the lantern, followed by Emma and Thomas. Sarah took the rear position with Marcus just ahead of her. As they moved deeper into the earth, leaving the sounds of gunfire behind, Sarah found herself studying Thomas's back, the straight shoulders, the determined set of his head, as he followed Frank without complaint. Blood or not, he was her son in all the ways that mattered, and she would die before letting anyone take him from her again. But first they needed to reach the cave behind the waterfall, where Ghost had hidden the truth that so many were willing to kill for. A truth that might change everything. Sarah thought she knew about her past, her mentor, and the life she had built from their ashes. The mine tunnels wound through the earth like the veins of some ancient creature, branching and rejoining in confusing patterns. Water dripped from overhead, in places the steady plinking echoing in the confined space. The air grew cooler and damper the deeper they traveled, carrying the musty scent of earth and old timbers. Frank led the way, the lantern casting long shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls. Emma and Thomas followed with Marcus behind them. Sarah brought up the rear, constantly glancing back to ensure they weren't being pursued. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Frank stopped at a junction where 3 tunnels branched off in different directions. This way, he said, gesturing toward the leftmost passage. Marcus frowned. Are you sure? I thought the western exit was through the right tunnel. We're not heading for the western exit, Frank replied, already moving into the left passage. We're taking a different route. Sarah's hand moved to her gun. To where exactly? Frank paused, turning back to face them. The lantern light cast his face in sharp relief, emphasizing the lines of pain and exhaustion etched there. To the only place we'll be safe, he said. The cave behind Redemption Falls. Sarah stiffened. How do you know about that? Ghost told me, Frank answered simply, before he rejected me as a student. It was his final lesson. There's always a place where truth is hidden, waiting for someone brave enough to face it. Thomas looked between them, confusion evident on his young face. What's in this cave? An uncomfortable silence fell. It was Marcus who finally answered, his voice unnaturally calm. Evidence, he said. Records that could destroy powerful men across 3 territories, including the man who ordered your mother's death. Thomas's eyes widened. My mother, Sarah moved to his side, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. This isn't the time, Marcus. When is the time, Sarah? Marcus challenged. After another ambush, after one of us dies, the boy deserves the truth. Frank intervened before Sarah could respond. We need to keep moving. They'll figure out we went into the tunnels eventually, and I'd rather not be underground when they do. Sarah nodded reluctantly. Lead on. As they continued through the tunnels, she stayed close to Thomas, watching his profile in the flickering lantern light. His face was set in the determined expression she knew so well, jaw tight, eyes forward, shoulders squared against whatever might come. Whether by blood or by choice, he was her son in all the ways that mattered. Ma, he whispered after several minutes of silence. Is it true what Mr. Ford said about my real mother? Sarah's heart constricted. Thomas, It's okay. He interrupted, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I just need to know. She took a deep breath. Yes, it's true that I'm not your birth mother, but I've been your mother in every other way since you were an infant. Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing this. And my birth mother, she was killed. Yes, Sarah confirmed, keeping her voice low so the others wouldn't hear. There was a fire. I was sent to rescue you. When I found you, she swallowed hard, the memory still vivid after 12 years. You were so small, so helpless. I couldn't leave you. So you took me. It wasn't a question. I was supposed to deliver you to someone else, Sarah admitted, but I couldn't. I went instead. Ghost, my teacher, he helped arrange everything. The move to Redemption Creek, the story about Daniel being your father? Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry. Then almost inaudibly he asked, did you ever regret it? Taking me, Sarah stopped, turning him to face her. In the dim light, his eyes, so like his birth mother's, searched her face for truth. Never, she said fiercely, not for one single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Thomas. No matter what you learn about your past, never doubt that. He nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Then, surprising her, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face against her shoulder. I love you, Ma, he whispered. Sarah held him tight, her own eyes stinging. I love you too, my brave boy. Ahead, Frank and Marcus had stopped allowing them this moment. Emma stood uncertainly beside her father, her young face reflecting a child's confusion at the complex emotions of adults. When Sarah and Thomas joined them, Frank simply nodded and continued leading the way, no comment made about their exchange. Sarah was grateful for his discretion. The tunnel began to slope upward, the air growing fresher. Eventually they reached a wooden door set into the rock face, its hinges rusted and its boards weathered. This is it, Frank announced, setting down the lantern to work on the door. This comes out in a ravine about 3 miles east of Redemption Creek. From there it's another 2 miles to the falls. The door protested as he pushed it open, sunlight streaming in and momentarily blinding them after so long in the darkness. They emerged into a narrow ravine, high walls of red rock rising on either side. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ground, suggesting they had only a few hours of daylight left. We should rest here, Marcus suggested, lowering himself to a boulder with a grimace of pain. His earlier wound had reopened during their escape, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Frank shook his head. We can't stop, not until we reach the cave. It's the only defensible position for miles. Sarah studied the ravine, her tactical mind assessing advantages and weaknesses. Marcus is right, we need to rest, and this position offers reasonable cover. You're wounded, Frank. So is Marcus. We're all exhausted, especially the children. After a moment's consideration, Frank nodded reluctantly. 1 hour, no more. Sarah helped Marcus tend to his wound, while Frank stood watch at the mouth of the ravine. Thomas and Emma sat together on a flat rock, speaking quietly. The girl seemed to have overcome some of her initial terror, though she still startled at sudden movements or sounds. "She'll be all right," Marcus said, following Sarah's gaze to the children. "Children are resilient." "Yes," Sarah agreed, tightening the bandage around his torso, "more than we give them credit for." Marcus winced as she secured the binding. "Sarah, about what I said earlier, about trading you." "You don't need to explain," she interrupted. "I understand a parent's desperation." "That's just it," he said, his voice lowered so only she could hear. "I'm not her father." Sarah froze her hands still on the bandage. "What?" Marcus wouldn't meet her gaze. "Emma is Katherine Johnson's daughter, Thomas's half-sister. She was adopted by a family in Willowbrook after the massacre." The revelation stunned Sarah into momentary silence. "Does she know?" "No," Marcus replied. "And neither does Frank. Only Ghost knew the full truth about both children." "Then why do you care so much about her?" Sarah asked, genuinely confused. "Why risk everything?" Marcus finally looked up, his eyes haunted. "Because I was there that night, at the compound. I helped set the fire." Sarah recoiled as if struck. "You—" "I was young, desperate for money," he continued, the words tumbling now as if a dam had broken. "The governor's men offered a small fortune to eliminate his problem. I didn't know there were children inside. When I realized—" He shook his head, the memory clearly painful. "I tried to get them out. Found Emma hiding in a root cellar but couldn't reach Thomas." "So your guilt drove you to watch over her?" Sarah concluded, disgust evident in her voice. "At first," Marcus admitted, "but over the years it became more. I couldn't adopt her officially, too many questions would be asked. But I made sure she was placed with a good family. I watched her grow up from a distance." "Until they took her to get to you," Sarah finished, "because they knew your connection." Marcus nodded miserably. "The same men who worked for the governor back then. The same ones who are hunting us now." Sarah processed this new information, fitting it into the increasingly complex puzzle of betrayal and secrets. "Does Frank know any of this?" "Only that I have a connection to Emma." Marcus grimaced as he shifted position. "If he knew I was involved in the massacre—" He didn't need to finish the thought. Frank's dedication to exposing the truth behind that night would make him unlikely to show mercy to one of its perpetrators. "Why tell me this now?" Sarah asked. Marcus looked over at the children again. "Because if something happens to me, someone needs to protect Emma too. She's as innocent in all this as Thomas." Before Sarah could respond, Frank's low whistle alerted them. He was crouched at the ravine entrance, rifle ready. "Riders," he reported as Sarah joined him. "6 of them heading this way. They're following our trail from the mine exit." Sarah peered around the rock face. In the distance, dust rose behind a group of mounted men moving at a steady pace toward their position. "How did they find us so quickly?" she wondered. Frank's expression darkened. "They must have someone who knows these tunnels as well as we do." "1 hour wasn't much of a rest," Sarah observed dryly. "How far to the falls from here?" "On foot with the children, at least 3 hours." Sarah made a quick calculation. "If we leave now, we'll be caught in the open. If we stay and fight, we might eliminate enough of them to buy some time." Frank nodded. "My thoughts exactly. But it needs to be us. The children need to keep moving toward the falls with Marcus." "Ma." Thomas had approached silently, his face worried. "What's happening?" Sarah turned to him, making a swift decision. "Thomas, you need to go with Marcus and Emma. Frank and I will catch up." The boy's expression hardened. "I'm not leaving you." "This isn't a discussion," Sarah said firmly. "Marcus is injured. He needs help getting Emma to safety. That's your responsibility now." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Sarah's tone stopped him. He nodded reluctantly. "Where are we going?" Sarah looked to Frank, who produced a small map from his coat pocket, hastily sketching a route. "Follow this ravine to its end, then head north across the ridge. The falls will be visible from there, you can't miss them." He handed the map to Thomas. "The cave entrance is behind the water, accessible by a narrow ledge on the left side." Marcus had joined them, supporting his weight against the rock wall. "We can make it," he assured Sarah. "I'll get them there safely." Sarah studied him, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake, trusting Thomas to a man who had just confessed to such a dark past. But his evident remorse combined with his devotion to Emma suggested he would indeed protect the children with his life. "Go now," she instructed. giving Thomas a quick, fierce hug. "Stay hidden, stay quiet, and don't stop until you reach the cave." Thomas hugged her back, then stepped away, his young face solemn with newfound responsibility. "I'll see you there." "You will," Sarah promised. "Now go." As Marcus led the children deeper into the ravine, following a narrow game trail that wound between the rocks, Sarah turned back to Frank. "You and I need to create enough of a distraction to convince them all three of us are still here," she said. Frank smiled grimly. "I was thinking exactly the same thing." 20 minutes later, Sarah was positioned on a rocky outcropping with a clear view of the ravine entrance. Frank had taken position on the opposite side, creating a crossfire zone that would catch their pursuers in the middle. The riders approached cautiously, clearly aware they were entering a potential ambush point. They dismounted 100 yards out, leaving 2 men with the horses while the other 4 advanced on foot. "Recognize any of them?" Sarah called softly to Frank. He studied the men through his rifle scope. "The one in the black coat, that's Jenkins, the governor's head of security. Beside him is Harlow, ex-military. The other 2 are hired guns, I believe." Sarah adjusted her aim, focusing on Jenkins. "The leader first." "My thoughts exactly," Frank confirmed. "On your shot." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying her hand. She could feel the weight of the moment, the responsibility of what they were about to do. These men weren't random outlaws. They were agents of a system that had oppressed and killed with impunity for years. The same system that had threatened her son. That thought hardened her resolve. She exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the ravine, followed immediately by Frank's. 2 men fell, Jenkins clutching his chest, one of the hired guns dropping without a sound. The remaining 2 dove for cover, returning fire with surprising accuracy. Bullets pinged off the rocks around Sarah as she rolled to a new position. Frank was doing the same on his side, using the terrain to stay unpredictable. "We need to keep them pinned down," he called. "Give Marcus and the children more time." Sarah nodded, firing again to force Harlow back behind a boulder. The 4th man was trying to work his way along the ravine wall, seeking a better angle. For several minutes, the exchange of gunfire continued, a deadly dance of advance and retreat. Sarah and Frank were better positioned, but the 2 remaining men were well-trained and disciplined. Then Sarah noticed movement near the horses. The 2 men left behind were mounting up. "Frank," she warned, "they're splitting up." He spotted them immediately. "They're going around. They must know another way into the ravine." His expression was grim. "They'll cut off Marcus and the children." Sarah made a split-second decision. "Cover me." Before Frank could protest, she slid down from her position, using the chaos of his covering fire to sprint across the open ground between rock formations. Bullets kicked up dust at her heels, but she moved too quickly to target effectively. Reaching the base of the ravine wall, she began climbing a difficult ascent up crumbling red stone. Her fingers found narrow ledges, her boots scraped for purchase. Years of training under Ghostwalker had made her body a perfect instrument for exactly this kind of maneuver. Below, Frank maintained a steady barrage, keeping the attention of their attackers. Sarah reached the top of the ravine wall, immediately dropping flat to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. From her elevated position, she could see the 2 mounted men circling around the ravine, heading for a narrow side canyon that would indeed intercept Marcus's path. Sarah crawled along the ridgeline, paralleling their course. When she judged the distance right, she rose to one knee, took careful aim, and fired. The first rider jerked in his saddle, then toppled slowly to the ground. The second wheeled his horse around, searching frantically for the source of the shot. Sarah's second bullet found him before he could locate her. Both horses bolted, running back the way they had come. In the ravine below, the gunfire had intensified. Sarah couldn't tell if Frank was still holding his own or if the remaining men had gained the advantage. She had a choice to make: return to help Frank or continue forward to ensure Marcus and the children reached the cave safely. The decision tore at her, but in her heart she knew there was only one choice she could live with. Thomas came first. Always. With a silent apology to Frank, Sarah began making her way across the ridge, heading north toward Redemption Falls. The journey was grueling. The terrain was rough, with loose rocks that shifted treacherously underfoot and sparse vegetation offering little shade from the late afternoon sun. Sarah pushed herself hard, knowing she needed to catch up to Marcus and the children before dark. As she crested a particularly steep incline, the landscape opened up before her. In the distance, she could see the silver thread of Redemption Creek winding through the valley, and beyond it, the white plume of the falls against the dark rock face. Movement caught her eye, three small figures making their way across the valley floor, still a good distance from the falls. Marcus was clearly struggling, his pace slowed by his injury. Thomas had taken Emma's hand, helping her over the rough ground. Sarah changed course, working her way down the hillside as quickly as she dared. She needed to reach them before they were spotted by anyone else. She was halfway down when she heard the distant crack of a rifle. The sound froze her in place, eyes frantically searching for its source. Then she saw them, two riders emerging from a copse of trees to the west, heading directly toward Marcus and the children. Sarah abandoned caution, half running, half sliding, down the rocky slope, heedless of the cuts and bruises accumulated in her descent. She hit the valley floor at a run, pushing her tired body to its limits. "Marcus!" she shouted, though they were still too far away to hear. "Behind you!" As if sensing her warning, Marcus turned, spotting the approaching riders. He pushed the children behind him, drawing his gun, despite his weakened state. Sarah was still too far to help, at least a quarter-mile separated them. She watched in horror as the riders closed the distance to Marcus and the children, guns drawn. Then, inexplicably, a third rider appeared from the east, moving at a full gallop toward the confrontation. Even at this distance, Sarah recognized the tall figure and distinctive riding style. Frank Raven had survived the ambush at the ravine. He reached the others moments before the hostile riders, cutting between them and Marcus, with his guns blazing. One of the pursuers fell immediately. The second returned fire, his shot catching Frank in the side. Despite the wound, Frank managed to put another bullet in the second rider, who slumped in his saddle before sliding slowly to the ground. By the time Sarah reached them, Frank had dismounted, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. Marcus was supporting him, while Thomas and Emma watched with wide eyes. "Thought you might need some help," Frank said as Sarah approached, his voice strained, but his eyes still alert. "How did you escape the ravine?" she asked, helping Marcus lower him to the ground. "Tunnel collapse," Frank explained between labored breaths. "Triggered some old dynamite. Buried Harlow and his friend, gave me a chance to get away." He looked up at her. "Figured you'd choose to follow the children." Sarah nodded, examining his wound. The bullet had passed clean through his side, missing vital organs, but causing significant blood loss. "We need to get him to the cave," Marcus said, his own face pale from exertion. "It's not much farther." Sarah tore strips from her shirt, creating a makeshift bandage for Frank. "Can you ride?" she asked. He nodded weakly. "Just get me on the horse." With Marcus's help, Sarah managed to get Frank back into the saddle. She turned to Thomas. "You and Emma ride with him. Marcus and I will walk alongside." Thomas nodded, his young face set with determination, as he helped Emma onto the horse behind Frank, then climbed up himself. Sarah handed him her second gun. "Just in case," she said quietly. They set off toward the falls, moving as quickly as Frank's condition would allow. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the valley and turning the plume of the waterfall into a column of gold and fire. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said as they walked, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. "About what's in the cave." Sarah glanced at him. "More revelations. The Black Book isn't just names and payments," he explained. "It contains Ghost's confession." "Confession to what?" Marcus hesitated. "To being the real father of Katherine Johnson's children." Sarah stopped in her tracks. "What?" "Ghost was Thomas and Emma's father," Marcus repeated. "The governor didn't just want to eliminate an illegitimate family, he wanted to destroy his political rival's legacy." The pieces suddenly fit together with terrible clarity. Ghost's insistence that Sarah rescue the child from the burning compound. His arrangement of her new identity in Redemption Creek. His continued monitoring of Thomas through Elijah. "He sent me to save his own son," Sarah whispered. Marcus nodded grimly. "And he kept it secret to protect the boy from the governor's men." "Does Frank know?" "I don't think so," Marcus replied. "Only Ghost Elijah, and now you and I know the full truth." Sarah processed this information as they continued toward the falls. The revelation explained so much about Ghost's actions, yet raised even more questions. Why hadn't he told her when the elaborate deception maintained even after his death? They reached the base of the falls as dusk descended. The roar of water cascading over the cliff face made conversation difficult, forcing them to communicate with gestures. Frank seemed to be weakening, slumping forward in the saddle, despite Thomas's supportive arm around his waist. Sarah helped him dismount, then turned to study the waterfall. It was an impressive sight, a sheet of water plunging nearly 100 feet from the cliff above into a churning pool below. Spray misted the air, creating a permanent rainbow when the light was right. The ledge is there, Frank said, pointing to a narrow pathway barely visible behind the edge of the falling water. It leads to a cave about 20 feet in. Sarah assessed the approach. The ledge was treacherous wet from constant spray, narrow enough that they would need to edge along it sideways. One misstep would mean a fall into the churning pool below. I'll go first, she decided. Thomas, you follow. Then Emma, Marcus, and Frank last. She turned to the wounded man. Can you make it? Frank nodded, though his face was ashen. I've come too far to stop now. Sarah approached the edge of the pool, gauging the best entry point to the ledge. The water's roar was deafening here, the spray soaking her clothes within seconds. She stepped carefully onto the slick stone, pressing her back against the cliff, face for stability. Inch by slow inch, she worked her way behind the curtain of water, careful not to look down at the churning pool below. The ledge narrowed at one point, forcing her to take a deep breath before a precarious step across a gap. Finally, her outstretched hand found the entrance to the cave, a dark opening in the rock face, invisible from the outside. She pulled herself into the relative dryness of the cave mouth, then turned back to guide Thomas across. One by one, they made the treacherous crossing, and Thomas, with remarkable steadiness, for his age, Emma trembling, but determined, Marcus wincing with each movement as his wound protested. Frank came last, his strength clearly failing. Halfway across, he stumbled, nearly losing his footing on the slick stone. Sarah lunged out, grabbing his arm and pulling him the rest of the way into the cave as the others watched with bated breath. Inside the cave opened up into a surprisingly large chamber, its walls smooth from centuries of water erosion when the falls had flowed differently. At the back, a small natural shelf held an oil lamp and a box of matches left there by Ghost Sarah presumed. She lit the lamp, its warm glow revealing the cave in greater detail. Along one wall were supplies, canned food, blankets, medical provisions. Ghost had prepared this place as a sanctuary. Over here, Frank said weakly, gesturing toward a specific section of wall. Sarah helped him across the cave. Up close, she could see that what appeared to be natural ridges in the stone were actually handholds, a clever concealment of a small door. Frank's fingers found the hidden mechanism, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a smaller chamber beyond. Inside this inner sanctum, a simple wooden table stood against the wall, supporting a leather-bound book in a sealed letter. Beside them sat an old wooden chest, its metal fittings tarnished with age. Frank staggered forward, reaching for the book with trembling hands. The Black Book, he murmured. Ghost's record of 3 decades of corruption and murder. Sarah's attention was drawn to the letter. Her name was written across it in Ghost's distinctive handwriting. For a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the muffled roar of the falls and their breathing, 5 people whose lives had been irrevocably shaped by the man who had created this hidden place. Open it, Thomas said quietly, nodding toward the letter. Please, Ma. With a deep breath, Sarah broke the seal and unfolded the paper within. Sarah, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have been drawn back into the life you tried to leave behind. For that I am sorry. Ghost's words flowed across the page in the same measured cadence with which he had spoken in life. The book contains everything, every name, every crime, every payment. Evidence that could bring down governors, judges, business empires. But that is not why I collected it, not entirely. When Sarah continued reading aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest. The truth you deserve to know is this: Thomas and Emma are my children. Their mother, Catherine, was the only woman I ever loved. When the governor ordered their deaths, I could not save Catherine. My enemies had ensured I was far away when the attack came. But I could save the children. Sarah paused, glancing at Thomas, who was listening with rapt attention, his young face a mixture of confusion and awe. I sent you for Thomas because you were the only one I trusted completely, the only student who understood that our work was never about death, but about justice. I arranged everything: your new identity, Daniel as your protector, Elijah as your guardian. Frank had sunk onto a stone bench, his wound forgotten as he absorbed this revelation. Marcus stood in the background, his expression unreadable. If one day Thomas chooses to kill me for my failures, for not saving his mother, for the life of violence I created, tell him to do it for himself, not for me. That was to be my final lesson to you both. Sarah's voice faltered as she read the next line. If you have discovered that Daniel was no simple miner, that he was in fact my agent placed to watch over you, and Thomas, do not judge him too harshly. He loved you both in his way, though his loyalty to me was his first priority. The letter continued explaining how Ghost had spent years gathering evidence against those responsible for the compound massacre, how he had discovered the governor's plan to eliminate all evidence, including Sarah and Thomas 5 years ago. Daniel's death was not an accident, Ghost wrote. He died protecting you, Sarah. Elijah witnessed it all. The men who arranged it are in the book, their crimes documented, waiting for justice. As Sarah neared the end of the letter, her voice grew stronger, resolute. My final request is this. Let Thomas decide what becomes of the book. It is his birthright, his legacy, the truth of who he is and what was done to his family. The choice to reveal it or bury it should be his alone. The letter ended with a single line. You were always more than my shadow, Sarah. You were my conscience. Silence fell in the cave as Sarah folded the letter. Thomas stood very still, his eyes fixed on some middle distance as he processed what he had heard. Frank was the first to speak. All this time, he said quietly, I thought Ghost rejected me because I wasn't good enough. But he was protecting his children's existence. And using all of us to do it. Marcus added a note of bitterness in his voice. Sarah looked at Thomas, who had moved to the wooden chest. Are you all right? She asked gently. He nodded slowly. I think so. It's just a lot. He placed his hand on the chest. What's in here? Open it, Sarah encouraged. Thomas lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay a pair of beautifully crafted revolvers similar to Sarah's, but sized for smaller hands. Beneath them was a leather-bound journal and a photograph of a beautiful woman holding twin infants. Your mother, Sarah said softly, and you and Emma as babies. Emma moved forward, hesitantly peering at the photograph. We're really brother and sister, she asked, looking at Thomas with new eyes. Thomas nodded, a tentative smile forming. Looks like it. Frank had pulled himself to his feet, moving to examine the black book. This evidence could still bring down those responsible, he said. Justice delayed but not denied. Ghost said it was Thomas's decision, Sarah reminded him. What the book becomes, who sees it, that's for him to decide. All eyes turned to the boy 12 years old and suddenly facing a choice that could affect the lives of countless people across 3 territories. Thomas looked from the book to the photograph of his mother, then to Sarah. His expression was serious beyond his years. What would you do, Ma? He asked simply. Sarah considered the question carefully. Truth has power, she said finally, but so does forgiveness. Both paths have merit. Thomas nodded, turning to Frank. You wanted to publish it to expose everyone. Why mine? Frank's expression was pained but honest. Because men like the governor have escaped justice for too long. Because your mother and many others deserve to have their stories told. And what happens after? Thomas pressed. When everyone knows. Frank had no immediate answer for that. Thomas turned to Marcus next. And you, what would you do? Marcus sighed heavily. Some secrets should stay buried, not to protect the guilty, but because the truth can hurt innocent people too. He glanced at Emma. Children shouldn't have to carry the weight of their parents' sins. Thomas absorbed this, then looked down at the book, the revolvers, the photograph, the legacy of a father he had never known, and a life he might have had. He began, then paused, finding the words. I want justice for my mother, but I don't want revenge. He looked up at Sarah. Ghost became what he hated, didn't he? Fighting evil with more evil. Sarah felt a surge of pride at his insight. Yes, she said softly. I think he did in the end. Thomas's decision seemed to crystallize in that moment. He closed the chest but picked up the black book. We take this to a judge, a good one, if there are any left. Let the law handle it. He looked at Frank. Isn't that what real justice is supposed to be? Frank studied the boy for a long moment, then nodded with reluctant respect. Your father would be proud, he said finally, though perhaps not for the reasons he would have expected. A noise from the cave entrance interrupted the moment, the sound of voices approaching footsteps. They had been found. Get back, Sarah ordered, drawing her guns as she moved toward the inner chamber's entrance. Frank. Despite his wound, he had straightened his own weapon ready. With you. Marcus pushed the children behind him, creating a last line of defense. Sarah stepped out into the main cave, Frank at her side, both prepared for a final confrontation. But the figure standing in the entrance wasn't one of the governor's men. It was Elijah. The old man leaned heavily on a walking stick, his clothes torn and bloodied, but his eyes clear and alert. Behind him stood several armed men Sarah didn't recognize. "Sarah," Elijah said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God you made it." "Elijah," Sarah lowered her gun slightly but remained wary. "How did you find us? Ghost's instructions?" he replied simply. "Left in case this day ever came." He gestured to the men behind him. "These are friends, former lawmen who wouldn't be bought. We've come to help." Sarah studied him. 12 years of trust, warring with recent revelations of deception. "You knew everything," she said. "About Ghost, about Thomas." "Yes," Elijah admitted. "It was my job to protect you both until Thomas was old enough to know the truth." His gaze moved past her to where Thomas now stood in the inner chamber's entrance. "Hello, son." Thomas regarded the old man with new understanding. "You were watching over us all along." Elijah nodded. "Your father's last request." Frank stepped forward, grimacing with pain. "The governor's men are being dealt with," Elijah finished. "We intercepted them at the base of the falls. It's over, Frank." Sarah wasn't entirely convinced. "And the others, the ones named in the book, that," Elijah said, "is going to take more time. But with ghost evidence and witnesses like us," he looked at Thomas, "it can be done right. The way your father should have done it from the beginning." Thomas moved to Sarah's side, his hand finding hers. "Together?" he asked quietly. She squeezed his hand, her decision made long ago. "Together." As they prepared to leave the cave to face whatever justice or challenges awaited in the world outside, Sarah looked back at the inner chamber one last time, at the ghostly legacy of a man who had shaped her life in ways both terrible and profound. She was no longer his shadow, and Thomas would never be compelled to follow his father's path. They would forge their own way forward, not as ghosts bound by the past, but as people defined by their own choices. In that moment, as Thomas smiled up at her with trust and newfound peace, Sarah knew that whatever came next, they would face it as what they truly were, a family. Not by blood, but by choice. And in the end, that was the only legacy that truly mattered. There's no such thing as clean hands, only those brave enough to show the bloodstains. Sarah Blackwood chose truth over vengeance, knowing it would cost her everything she'd ever built. Ghostwalker's legacy was never about heroes or villains. It was about lines blurred beyond recognition, about shadows cast by righteous men. Frank Raven found redemption in sacrifice. Marcus Ford discovered honor in betrayal, and Thomas, born from bloodshed, learned that family isn't bound by the blood you share, but by the scars you carry together. Yet even now, ghosts linger in Redemption Creek. The truth uncovered here is too raw, too powerful to stay buried. It moves through whispers carried by wind and water, through generations that never asked for the burden of their father's sins. So ask yourself, who deserves forgiveness? Who deserves punishment? When justice and revenge wear the same face, how can you know you've chosen right? Maybe in the end, it's not about good or evil. Maybe it's simply about having the courage to face the truth, no matter how much it hurts, no matter the price. Because here's the thing about truth, once you fire that bullet, you can't call it back. The West remembers, and now so will you.